Great, so we're gonna start. So welcome everyone. My name is Zana Wolcott. I'm the Community Outreach Coordinator at Friends of the Teton River. I am just going to introduce Max and Mike, who are the presenters today. So we have Max Lewis, the Fisheries Crew Lead at Friends of the Teton River, and then Mike Lien, the Restoration Director at Friends of the Teton River. Max is going to kick us off. He's going to talk about our tributary survey that was completed last summer, and a little bit more about the Fisheries Monitoring Program. And Mike will share a little bit about restoration projects that have gone hand in hand with our fisheries research that we've done. As you all are joining, if you have questions while Max or Mike are talking, feel free to type it in the Q&A chat box on the side. I'll try to monitor those so that if it's pertinent to what Max or Mike is talking about, I'll ask those questions for you. And then at the end, we'll also have about 10 minutes or so to have a Q&A so that you can ask questions yourself. Feel free to use the hand raise feature too, and I can keep an eye on that. So I'm going to pass it off to Max to get us started here. So go ahead, Max.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for putting this together. Thanks everyone for taking their lunch break. And yeah, I'm excited to tell you a bit about what I've been up to in the last year. I've been with FTR for about a year now. So this encompasses all the work I've done. And I'll give you a good update on what's going on in the watershed. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. All right, is that looking good?
Looks great.
Great. Yeah, so a little bit of state of the fishery report. I think the work we've done here at FTR over the year will give you a good idea of how the fishery is doing in the watershed and fill you in. So our scope of work in 2020 included that tributary assessment in the Teton River watershed. That was the cornerstone of our work this year and kept me really busy from June through September. I'll also update you on the data that Idaho Fish and Game has collected over the past 2 years on the main stem of the Teton River. Our pit tag interrogation site operation and tagging efforts, as well as the findings at those pit tag interrogation sites. Our spawning Yellowstone cutthroat trout red surveys, where we walk along stream banks and look for spawning fish. Genetic sampling collection on top of Idaho Fish and Game kept me busy in the spring as well. And then I'll pass it on to Mike for some stream and riparian restoration project updates. I know many of you are here in the Teton River watershed, and some of you may not be. So here's a map of our watershed. I'm currently sitting in Driggs in the upper Teton River section of the watershed, and the Teton River flows from its headwaters near Victor and on Teton and Pine Creek Pass down to its confluence of the Henry's Fork, where that waterfall continues on to the Snake River. This year, our focus was really on the tributary streams coming out of the Teton Wilderness and the Teton Range. And Friends of the Teton River and FTR is really focused on Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Yellowstone cutthroat trout are the native trout species to the region and to the watershed. But unfortunately, Yellowstone cutthroat trout aren't necessarily thriving throughout their historic range. They're only in 43% of their historic range, and the Teton River watershed is a key part of the range where they still occupy. Yet the Teton River watershed is not completely dominated by Yellowstone cutthroat trout, as we do have many non-native fish species. So FTR works to conserve, restore, and protect Yellowstone cutthroat trout populations and their habitat. This graph is a graph that many of you who live in the watershed may have seen in the past. It's the kind of the graph that represents why Friends of the Teton River came to be and some of their successes over the past 20 years as a not-for-profit. In 2003 and 2005, Idaho Fish and Game surveys on the main stem of the Teton River found historically low numbers of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. In 2003, cutthroat trout were only 3% of the fish composition, and the Teton River was dominated by eastern brook trout and rainbow trout. Today, Yellowstone cutthroat trout are around 25% of the fish composition in the Teton River, and they've been at that similar number for the past decade now. That's a huge success and one that we continue to hope to build on. The fisheries crew at Friends of the Teton River's goals are to determine long-term trout population trends, to provide the agencies with additional data on the Teton River watershed, to identify, prioritize, and design Yellowstone cutthroat trout conservation projects, and then we need to monitor the efficacy of those conservation projects to ensure that all the work, the time and the money that we spend on restoring and preserving Yellowstone cutthroat trout is being well spent, and that fish are responding to those projects. The cornerstone of our monitoring efforts are the basin-wide electrofishing survey. That survey was first established in 2005, and it has our crew traveling throughout the watershed into the highest and most remote parts of it in order to survey really critical Yellowstone cutthroat trout habitat and survey that habitat for any changes in their species compositions. As I noted, that survey started in 2005. In 2005, we established 133 sites. Each one of those sites is 100 meters long. And it was with the help of Dr. Rob Van Kirk at the Henry's Fork Foundation, who created that survey methodology and who continues to do the statistical analysis on our data that we collect. And the original scope of that survey was on 11 Teton River tributaries flowing from both the Bighorn Mountain Range as well as the Teton Mountain Range. And when we do that full survey, this is what our survey site map ends up looking like. We did the full survey in 2005 as well as 2015 and visited all 133 sites. The sites in yellow represent sites where we found Yellowstone cutthroat trout. The sites in red represent sites where we found rainbow trout. And the sites in blue represent where we found eastern brook trout. So as you can see, our watershed is kind of a mosaic of species compositions. And there's only really a few tributary streams where Yellowstone cutthroat trout continue to dominate the species composition. And that's something that FTR is concerned about, but we'll continue to work on to better Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So for our 2020 scope of work, we decided to tackle 68 sites out of those initial 133. Those sites were on Trail, Teton, South Lee, North Lee, Moose, Game, Canyon, Calamity, Bitch, and Badger Creeks. We had a lot of help from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department as well as the Idaho Fish and Game Department. Wyoming Game and Fish crews got the luck of the draw to head to Moose Creek and Badger Creek, some of the thickest and least accessible creeks in our survey area. And the sites we chose to survey this year were all on streams where you have either completed restoration projects in the past or we plan to complete restoration projects. By doing that, we're able to have a really strong idea or a really strong data set that shows if trout are responding to those conservation projects, or if we're going to do restoration projects in the future, we create a baseline of data that we can then compare to once those restoration projects are complete. And what these surveys entail is carrying all of our equipment to these survey sites, which many times require off-trail travel or travel high into the Teton wilderness, many times miles and thousands of vertical feet to get there. We use a backpack electrofishing unit, which is carried by the crew, and that backpack electrofishing unit puts an electric pulse through the water column. That pulse temporarily stuns the trout within that stretch of the river. Once those trout are stunned, we're able to collect them with nets. And once we have those trout, we, of course, keep them in buckets, keep them wet, and then we collect the data we need, which includes their length, their species, a lot of times genetic data, as well as many times installing pit tags into those fish so we can track their movements. The exact sites that were first established in 2005 are visited on each survey thereafter. Every change to those sites is noted, as well as any environmental factors that might kind of change the quality of our surveys. If there's a rainstorm or a thunderstorm or the river's really high or low, we'll note that so that we can really try to control our surveys and have a strong data set. And you can see in the pictures on the bottom, these creeks tend to change a lot, whether it be falling logs or the whole stream rearranging itself and moving And as we try to find these sites, a lot of times we're moving through thick vegetation and don't get eyes on the creek until we're physically in it. So we have to go walking around and using GPS points in those reference photos from 2005 in order to find the exact site location. So here's a map of where we ended up working this summer during our field season. So we covered many of those tributary streams that were first established in 2005, but not quite all of them. And as you can see, many of the sites were super high in the Tetons, going all the way up to Green Mountain Lakes, and into some of those really remote stretches of Badger and Bitch Creek. And when it was all said and done, we had a ton of data to analyze. Rob Van Kirk, yet again, helped us out with some analysis of that data. And here are our findings. In the graph, you can see the estimated number of trout per 100 meters of stream, and then all the years we've done a survey. This graph includes the 8 streams we've surveyed 4 times, which is every year we've completed this survey. And the black line is the mean trend line of the fisheries abundance on those streams. And then the colored lines are for each individual stream. The analysis of the data collected over the past 15 years shows that there is a marginally significant decreasing trend in total trout abundance of 2% per year. Despite a decline in total abundance, there are no changes in the Yellowstone cutthroat trout species composition, signaling that Yellowstone cutthroat trout continued to do well in the watershed. Mean species composition was 45% Yellowstone cutthroat trout and continues to be. So yeah, that species composition has not changed over time, which is something we're really glad to see, that Yellowstone cutthroat trout aren't being increasingly outcompeted by non-native fish. Yet we do hope to see an increasing trend in total fish abundance in our watershed, and of course, an increasing trend in Yellowstone cutthroat trout abundance. And that's something we're well aware of, and FTR will continue to work on and monitor via our monitoring efforts, and as well as, of course, our conservation projects. And moving on, I'll just give you a little more of a fine-tuned picture of stream by stream population composition, or the proportion of Yellowstone cutthroat trout in each stream. These are kind of our key cornerstone Yellowstone cutthroat trout streams, where we have our healthy Yellowstone cutthroat trout populations. These streams are incredibly important to the Teton River watershed, but as well as the Yellowstone cutthroat trout historic range as a whole, as these streams are really, really healthy, clean, clear wilderness waters where non-native fish have not begun to outcompete Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Bitch Creek, Badger Creek, and Darby Creek are those streams where trout at Yellowstone are doing really well. Bitch Creek has an incredibly high number of Yellowstone cutthroat trout with an estimated abundance of 9,000 fish in that stream. And as some of you may know, there are some really beautiful fish in lower Bitch Creek. At the confluence of the Teton River, these streams have a different species composition, yet these species compositions represent the upper reaches of those streams. As at the Teton River, there are some non-native fish that travel from the main stem of the Teton, but they have not been able to access those more pristine, higher elevation wilderness waters. And then moving on to some more of the bad news and kind of the reality of the watershed, in that eastern brook trout have really have a strong hold on many of our tributary streams, including Trail, Northley, Game, and Fox Creek. Both on Trail and Northley Creek, we do find some relatively large residential cutthroat trout in those streams in every one of our surveys, showing that there is hope and that Yellowstone cutthroat trout continue to do relatively well in those streams, and there's hope of those populations rebounding. And we've also found fluvial fish that have moved from the main stem of the Teton River and into those tributary streams in order to spawn during our surveys in those creeks, which is a really promising sign and shows that those Yellowstone cutthroat trout could, with the help of FTR, could potentially increase in numbers and hopefully someday outcompete brook trout yet again. And then a couple streams of note. Canyon Creek is a stream that we're concerned about, as in 2015, Yellowstone cutthroat trout were more abundant than eastern brook trout, and that trend has changed. So in 2015, Yellowstone cutthroat trout accounted for 56% of the trout sampled in Canyon Creek. During our 2020 survey on Canyon Creek, Yellowstone cutthroat trout only accounted for 34% of the trout population. This decline did not correspond with a decrease in abundance of fish. indicating a displacement of Yellowstone cutthroat trout by brook trout. That's a trend we really don't like to see, and it's rather startling to us. But it should be noted that we only surveyed 5 sites in the Canyon Creek watershed this year, and there's only been 2 years of surveys. So we really don't have a huge data set for Canyon Creek, but it's definitely a stream where we have some ongoing restoration projects, and we hope to collect more data to make sure that the trends we're seeing are correct right now, but in hopes of finding that Yellowstone cutthroat trout are doing better than we think there. And then Teton Creek is, of course, one of our most beloved tributary streams, as it runs through the popular Teton Creek recreation corridor, through the town, and then through the towns of Alta and Driggs before depositing in the upper Teton River. Teton Creek and the upper portions of that river or creek are dominated by eastern brook trout. Yet we do find a relatively stable population of residential Yellowstone cutthroat trout in the upper portions of that stream. We also find fluvial fish once in a blue moon up past upstream of Alta, but there's a ton of fluvial Yellowstone cutthroat trout in lower Teton Creek. We know that thanks to our pit tag sites, and we know that Teton Creek has the potential to be a hugely important spawning tributary to Yellowstone cutthroat trout if we're able to continue to restore that tributary stream. And then Pack Saddle Creek runs out of the big holes and was not surveyed this year. It is unfortunately dominated by brook trout.
And what Max means by fluvial, that's spawners. So any cutthroat that are making their way from Teton River up into the mountains to spawn, that's considered or called a fluvial cutthroat. And like he was saying, there's still some good data that we have now that those big spawners are still moving from Teton River into upper Teton Creek. So that's super encouraging.
Thanks, Mike, for that clarification there. And then moving on, just our last few graphs here are Little Pine, Mahogany, and Horseshoe, which all flow out of the Big Hole Mountains, have had Yellowstone cutthroat trout in the past, yet are dominated by brook trout. And those are much smaller abundances of fish in each one of those creeks, but it is unfortunate that brook trout dominate. And on the upper section of those streams are Yellowstone cutthroat trout. In 2025, will be interesting to see what we find in those big hole streams. And then Moose Creek, of note, we found one hybrid there this year, which is rather notable. That's a hybrid between Yellowstone cutthroat trout and rainbow trout, but that stream has been consistently dominated by brook trout throughout. And as far as our findings go for 2020, this is what our watershed looks like. As you saw in that 2015 map, our watershed has some really great strongholds of Yellowstone cutthroat trout populations, and then some streams where brook trout dominate. We hope to see that map change and our abundance and species compositions change over time, but it's what drives Friends of Teton River's work. Moving on down to the main stem and out of those tributary streams, I'm going to talk a bit about what Idaho Fish and Game has found and update you on their past 2 years of surveys on the main stem of the Teton River. In the top left hand of this map, there's a little fish, and next to it says Parkinson Tagging Reach. That tagging reach is in the Teton River Canyon, and we visited that section of the stream this past September in order to conduct electrofishing survey. And then in 2019, Idaho Fish and Game electrofished the Breckenridge Tagging Reach as well as the Bates Tagging Reach, which can be found in between Teutonia and Driggs on this section of the map. Also on this map are some green and red crosses. The green crosses represent pit tag sites that are currently active, and the red crosses represent pit tag sites that are not currently active, either due to equipment malfunctions or access to those tributary streams, or issues with access to those tributary streams. The Teton River Canyon electrofishing was a great experience, as it brought us down into that Teton River Canyon, a really beautiful and hard to access stretch of the river. We joined Idaho Fish and Game for that effort. Friends of the Teton River crew worked to pit tag fish, as well as to weigh, measure, and note the species of those fish on behalf of Idaho Fish and Game, while the Idaho Fish and Game crews did the actual electrofishing. The electrofishing works in much the same way as the backpack electrofishing, yet it's based out of a raft, so they can shock many more fish. And while we were down there with Idaho Fish and Game, we found some really, really promising numbers. Yellowstone cutthroat trout numbers, as well as rainbow trout numbers in that section of the river, have seen a tremendous increase since 2015. In our 2019 estimate, there are an estimated 1,229 Yellowstone cutthroat trout per mile in the Parkinson stretch of the Teton River. That is up from an estimated 389 Yellowstone cutthroat trout per mile in 2015. So that's a huge increase in the number of fish. Idaho Fish and Game found fish of all size and age class. So there's a really healthy, robust population of fish down there. And some of the fish we caught while on that stretch of the river were truly beautiful fish. And it's a great section of the Teton River, and we're really happy to see an increasing number of Yellowstone cutthroat trout. While we were there with Idaho Fish and Game, we were able to pit tag over 200 Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And we know that Canyon Creek is a really important spawning tributary to that section of the river. So we hope to see some of those pit tagged fish at our pit tag interrogation site this coming spring, which would indicate that fish are moving from the Teton River Canyon and into Canyon Creek. And then moving on to the Nickerson Reach. That reach of the river is from the South Bates to the Bates Bridge, one of the most popular sections of river here on the Upper Teton. It's a great fishing stretch of river, as well as tubing, paddleboarding stretch. And on that stretch of river, we've seen a tremendous rise in the number of Yellowstone cutthroat trout since 2003, with fish continuously increasing in their abundance. In 2019, Idaho Fish and Game survey found 697 Yellowstone cutthroat trout per mile, which is similar to the 2017 estimate of 704 cutthroat trout per mile. The 10-year average on that stretch of river for Yellowstone cutthroat trout per mile is 561. So we're really glad to see an above average abundance of fish on that stretch of river, yet we do note that there is a small decrease in the number of fish. That's something that Friends of the Teton River will continue to monitor. It is notable that all fish species decreased in abundance, including brook trout and rainbow trout. And it should also be noted that Yellowstone cutthroat trout compromise more of the fish in that stretch of river than rainbow trout for the first time in a while. So we're really glad to see that. And here's just a huge Yellowstone cutthroat trout being held by Brett High, who's the regional fisheries manager, the man who makes all the monitoring happen in this region. And hopefully we can all get out on the Teton and fish for a hog like that. It's just beautiful fish worth sharing. And then moving on to some not so good news on the Breckenridge Reach of the river, which is in between Pack Saddle and Harrop's Bridge, which downstream of the Nickerson Reach. There, Yellowstone cutthroat trout numbers are up from a really historically low in 2003. In 2019 is estimated there's 67 cutthroat trout per mile. And the 10-year average of cutthroat trout per mile on that stretch of river is 31 trout per mile. But there was a huge increase in the number of brown trout found on that section of river. Since 2013, brown trout catch rates increased to 28, then to 32, and then in 2019, that survey found 145 brown trout. We're really concerned with that increase in brown trout, as the Teton River is good habitat for brown trout, and it's a habitat where they could potentially outcompete Yellowstone cutthroat trout. As many of you know, brown trout are really voracious eaters, and they've been known to extirpate Yellowstone cutthroat trout from watersheds where they become well established. And then, of course, that Breckenridge stretch of river has a ton of rainbow trout as well as brook trout too. Just to drive home our concern with the number of brown trout are species composition pie charts. In 2015, Yellowstone cutthroat trout were 2.5% of the species composition, while brown trout were 1.9%. That number increased on behalf of the brown trout in 2017, and then in 2019, brown trout comprised 7.9% of the trout found in that section of the river, where Yellowstone cutthroat trout were only 4.2%. So obviously brown trout have began to outcompete Yellowstone cutthroat trout and hurt their numbers in general. It also should be noted that we found brown trout, or an agency found brown trout in the Teton River Canyon at the Felt Dam site recently for the first time in recorded history. So the rise in brown trout is really concerning, and it's something FTR is going to continue to work on and explore options for ensuring that we can continue to benefit and conserve Yellowstone cutthroat trout in our watershed.
Max, if I may, so this is something that's on Idaho Fish and Game's radar. Seeing this large increase in brown trout, not only, it used to be we just see the larger ones, but what we're seeing now is all age classes. So we know that they are reproducing in the upper Teton River. And so there's some discussion on Idaho Fish and Game possibly removing brook trout from the upper Teton River. That will be further down the road, and there'll be public outreach for that. Friends Teton River certainly is in support of that, but will be very interested to hear on exactly how Idaho Fish and Game wants to approach that, and will be participating in that public outreach that Idaho Fish and Game will be spearheading. So this is any type of removal of non-natives is up to the agencies completely. We just help support the agencies in any way we can. But unfortunately, when brown trout move into a watershed, this is exactly the type of things that you expect to see, and this has happened throughout the West. All other species decline. Brook trout do not discriminate. They will eat everything. And thanks, Max. Back to that. And it could very well be that what we're seeing in the decline in terms of trout abundance out on Teton River in the last 4 to 5 years is in fact due to brown trout. That's what has happened in many other watersheds, and it is very possible that that's what we're seeing here. So better to take care of brown trout issues as soon as you can. Once they become established, they're obviously much more difficult to remove, and in the event of a endangered species listing for Yellowstone cutthroat trout, which many agency personnel feel is imminent, then it's likely that the brown trout will be removed either way. So better to take care of it sooner than later. But again, this is going to be a large concerted public outreach prior to removing brook trout that will be spearheaded and led by Idaho Fish and Game. Thanks, Max.
Thanks, Mike. And then on to our annual monitoring. This is kind of what keeps me busy every field season, and is what we've been doing for the past 20 years as far as monitoring the watershed goes. That includes pit tagging trout, the pit tag arrays, downloading data, and as well as maintenance at those pit tag arrays, red surveys on our spawning streams, and fish screen maintenance, which are screens on irrigation diversions, keeping fish out of those diversions and in the river. To date, we've pit tagged over 5,000 fish in the watershed. Those pit tags monitor fish movements and the effectiveness of watershed restoration. We can measure the effectiveness of watershed restoration as we can detect increases in numbers of fish moving into a restored section of the stream. And if we find those fish moving into that restored section of the stream during the spring spawning season, we can infer that those fish are moving to that section of the stream in order to spawn. A pit tag is a small tag that has a unique number. That tag is implanted into a fish, and where that fish is caught, that fish's species and length are all noted when that tag is installed into the fish. This is an example of why a pit tag array system might end up needing maintenance. This is our pit tag array at Bitch Creek, and as you can see, when we have those spring runoff events in May and June, some of those pit tag array sites get kind of hammered by those high flows. So I end up in the spring and fall tromping around and fixing these sites relatively often, but I also need to visit these sites in order to download the data off of them and add it to our database. So in 2020, this is what our pit tag arrays found. The green line on this graph represents the numbers of fish detected by day at Teton Creek. The blue line, which is, you can see popping up once in a while, is number of fish detected at Fox Creek. And yellow line is Six Springs Creek. Six Springs is a tributary to to Teton Creek and is a really important spawning spring creek that is on the Teton Valley Land Trust property. And then Canyon Creek, which only had one detection, so it's not really visible on this graph. But as you can see here, fish are mostly spawning in between mid-May and mid-June when they're moving into those tributary streams. So if you see any really clean looking gravel, it's kind of an oval shape while you're out fishing this spring, be aware and try not to step on those spawning reds. And here's another graph I put together using stream flows on the Teton River, and then our pit tag data at our Teton Creek interrogation site. These stream flows are from the South Lee site on the Teton River, and they're represented in the blue line. And then on the orange line is our number of fish detected at our pit tag sites. So it's notable that Yellowstone cutthroat trout detect a rise in the hydrograph, an increased amount of stream flow in the river. And when they detect that rise in the hydrograph, they move upstream into spawning tributaries where they can potentially find lower velocity sections of river in order to spawn in and reproduce in. And then some of those fish miss that rise in the hydrograph and move upstream on the descending arm of the hydrograph in the Teton River. It's projected that runoff will be earlier this year, so it'll be interesting to see if that spawning timing moves significantly due to that earlier runoff. And then as you can see, we had fish detected all the way up until August. Once we detect fish in August and July, it's likely fish that are just moving into that habitat, but not to spawn. And then moving on to red surveys. Red surveys are when I walk along a section of the stream looking for those gravel spots where the gravel has been cleaned out by spawning Yellowstone cutthroat trout. When I find those, I can take note of them and take note of how many pairs of Yellowstone cutthroat trout are using that stream in order to spawn. This year, we conducted red surveys on Six Springs Creek, Lewes Spring Creek, which are both tributaries of the Teton River, and then Headwaters Spring Creek near Victor, which is part of the headwaters system that feeds the upper Teton River. And then as well as Canyon and Calamity Creeks on the upper sections of those creeks, and I'm doing red surveys there in order to create a red survey program on those sections of the stream, as there are sections of stream that have recently had restoration projects near them. Our red count data isn't the most robust on many of these creeks, as we haven't done red surveys historically in the past. Yet this past spring and continuing this spring, I'm working to normalize and create a baseline red survey program for FTR so that we can have a more abundant data set. One place where we do have really abundant red survey data is on Six Springs Creek, as we've continuously had access to that section of the river, and it is relatively accessible and viewable by the red surveyor. 2020 number of reds was similar to 2018 and years before that. In 2019, there's really turbid water, so it was really hard to observe any reds. And then at our other survey sites, there just isn't robust data to make any inferences from, but we will have that in the future. This spring, I also collected genetic samples to be passed along to the Idaho Fish and Game lab, where they do genetic analysis. We collected genetic samples while electrofishing, and I also had the treat of collecting genetic samples from mountain whitefish. We caught those mountain whitefish via rod and reel on the Teton River in the spring, and it turns out when you're fishing for whitefish on purpose, they're rather hard to catch. I think they're easier to catch when you're going after cutties. So if you're ever looking for a whitefish, just keep doing what you're doing and you'll have great luck. And those samples that we send to the Idaho Fish and Game lab the lab technicians there are able to look at those genetic samples and detect where that fish spawned, or if those fish are genetically different from fish on other sections of the river or in other spawning tributaries, which can be really valuable data to see if, say, Felt Dam has caused a difference in genetic makeup within fish, and to see if Felt Dam maybe has stopped fish from migrating throughout the Teton River corridor historically. And then just to wrap up, Rob Van Kirk at the Henry's Fork Foundation has created some water year predictions, and he's also offered a little bit of an angling projection. You can't really tell anyone how their angling is going to be this coming fishing season, but based on the water year, we can give you some projections. So we're looking at a rather bleak projection for water year based on snow water equivalent. You can see in the green line on this graph, we had a really high peak runoff in late May of water in the Teton River. And this year we're projected to have a much lower runoff and overall a kind of a lower flow in the Teton River. So that's due to a thin snowpack and little late winter season precipitation within this watershed. Yeah, we have had 4 good water years in a row, so it's not looking too bleak. There's a pretty bad drought in 2016, which we're comparing to, and we're looking better off than back in 2016. We've had a relatively or rather healthy fish population over the past 4 years, and those fish have been able to reproduce over the past 4 years. So there's still going to be lots of fish in the Teton River, which should lead to some really good angling. And good news, I think because of that low water flow and earlier snowmelt runoff, we're going to be able to fish 2 to 3 weeks earlier on the Teton River. So that's something to look forward to, but also should be noted in that late season flows might cause for warmer water in the Teton River than we've seen in the past couple of years, which can be really stressful for trout. So that's something we're aware of and that we're going to monitor for here at FTR. And Rob Van Kirk has a more detailed and better written projections for the coming water year. If you're interested in it, reach out to me or to him. Thank you everyone for your time. And I think I'm going to pass the show on to Mike, and I'll be around at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that I can.
Hey, Mike, maybe before you get started, could I ask a couple of questions, Max?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. And yeah, maybe we'll just a couple of questions that came in. One was maybe to elaborate on how and when cutthroat migrate up Teton Creek, especially when it's dry for so much of the year. You mind giving a little bit more information about that?
Yeah, so we're basically inferring that a lot of those fish that are moving up Teton Creek are only moving up in that lower valley section where it has not dried out in the middle there. But we do find that some fish during our runoff season, during that peak runoff, fish are able to move up into upper Teton Creek. We have a pit tag interrogation site in Alta as well, where we've detected a few fish that were detected at the lower section. And during spring runoff, the Teton Creek is connected. So those fish are able to move into the upper stretches of Teton Creek. Mike might be able to answer some more questions.
Yeah, so we estimate that the total number of spawning cutthroat or these fluvial cutthroat that move into Teton Creek in any given year, it's right around 2,000 or so. So we're looking at thousands of spawners that enter Teton Creek. The vast majority of those spawn in the perennial section or the lower section of Teton Creek west of the highway. And then some of those go up that little spring creek that comes off down there, that Six Springs as well. There are a handful that make it up into the mountain section every year, right around the beginning of June is when we've had our detections at the Alta interrogation site. And so typically Teton Creek connects about May 15th or so, about the middle of May. So a few weeks after that. And as the hydrograph is starting to really ramp up, usually about mid-June is when we have our peak runoff on average. Those spawners will move up, and probably we're guessing there's probably in the low hundreds, maybe 100 or 200 of those spawners that still move into the upper perennial section of Teton Creek up in the mountains. And the one fish that we were able to track the whole way up and down using the tag interrogation sites, that fish somehow made it back out. It was a fish that was tagged in the Breckenridge Reach of Teton River. And so somehow it didn't end up entrained in the canals. There's a whole number of canals that a lot of times these bigger spawning cutthroat will end up in and then eventually die in those canals. But really the big other important part of this is that the offspring from those spawners and from resident cutthroat as well in the upper Teton Creek section, it's likely that very few of those ever get back down to Teton River. Certainly isn't enough time in the summer as they would need water probably about mid-August in Teton Creek to make it back down. And Teton Creek historically is dewatered again by middle of July. So, but somehow, some way, there's still a handful of those offspring that either wait it out and then in upper Teton Creek and then head down in the spring when it's connected and keep that spawning run alive. By all estimates, we figure that prior to diversions being installed on Teton Creek, that the number of spawners that would have made it into the mountains would have been in the thousands. Pine Creek, for example, over on Pine Creek Pass, which is a much smaller system than Teton Creek, averages about 3,000 spawners per year. Idaho Fish and Game has a weir there, and they count those spawning cutthroat. So, so again, most of that run has been lost, but we're working hard to reestablish that spawning run into Upper Teton Creek.
Great, thanks. A question, was the North Fork of Mahogany Creek surveyed this year?
No, it was not.
Okay, great. And then maybe just, I'll ask a couple more questions and then we'll hand it over to you, Mike, and we'll keep going and then we'll keep answering questions at the end. We'll open up for full Q&A. Is there any thought on why the Parkinson Reach has an increase in YCT or cutthroat numbers?
Yeah,
on
I
the
was
main
going to
stem?
dive into that, but we can get into it now. So,
okay, well, we'll hold on on it, Mike. We'll just hand it off to you, Mike, and then if any of the questions that have been asked or not answered, we'll jump into those in the Q&A after. So go ahead, Mike.
All right. Okay, where's my presentation? That should be there. Give me 1 second. For some reason it was there and it's not popping up. There it is. Best laid plans, right? Here we go. All right, I see you there, Zena. There we go. And share screen. Okay. All right. Well, really appreciate everybody tuning in today for this. And again, if there's questions that we don't get answered today, feel free to reach out at any time. Get a hold of us to ask those questions, and we'll be around. So to take a look at, let's see, can I hide this? So as Max had mentioned, back in 2003, conservation projects started in earnest in this watershed. It really was a call to arms by the late 90s, early 2000s, when we saw the Idaho Fish and Game electrofishing data from Teton River, and we saw those populations of trout just crashing, and in particular Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So folks got fired up, including Friends of the Teton River and Teton Regional Land Trust, private landowners, the county, cities, you name it. Everybody really jumped in to improve habitat for the fisheries, focus in on specific Yellowstone cutthroat trout projects, conservation projects, and also to improve water quality within the watershed. So to date, approximately 27 significant stream restoration projects have been completed. We've restored, this whole group have restored about 6 miles of stream. And that's led to not only a vast improvement in fisheries habitat, but also a sediment load reduction. So this is all the sediment and silt washing into the stream, wash into the streams and into the watershed from those eroding banks. So we've managed to reduce that by an estimated 4,600 tons per year. That's about 260 dump truck loads per year. That's no longer entering our streams. And so we've also installed 3 fish screens. I'll show you some photos of that in a minute, in canals. We worked to install 8 fish ladders to improve fish passage on our key tributaries. And then we've got our active flow restoration program. More water, more fish, especially in key tributaries where Yellowstone cutthroat trout are thriving. And then we work with irrigators to manage the canals differently. So when they go to shut off their canals, for example, they can ramp them down, close them slowly so that trout have a chance to get up and out of those canals. And so these graphs right here, these bar charts show the densities of trout over time. Max showed you some of that proportional data, had some numbers as well. So what we see is here's 2003 when we really started cranking on conservation projects. This is that Nickerson Reach that Idaho Fish and Game electrofishes on Teton River. And over time, we see this amazing and significant jump in trout populations. Of course, the yellow is Yellowstone cutthroat trout, red rainbows, blue brook trout. So all ships are rising, but the great news here is that Yellowstone cutthroat trout numbers continue to improve. And we saw in this is up to 2017, 2019, we saw that drop down a little bit, but still doing really well. In 03, they were down to 14 cutthroat per mile. And by 2017, we were 936 per mile, and then a little less in 2019, but pretty close to that. So dramatic improvement in fisheries. Of course, we went from 420 trout, all species, per mile up to almost 4,000 trout per mile in that same time period. And down at the Breckenridge Reach, again, that's really, that area is really dominated by rainbows. This is down from 4,000 of the pack saddle down to the highway. And we saw a big explosion during that same time period, and rainbow and brook trout numbers down there. And as Max showed earlier, cutthroat are hanging in there as well. So we took a look at what could be causing this dramatic increase in trout population since 03, and worked with the agencies and research institutes, and we looked at hydrology, temperature, changes in fisheries management by Idaho Fish and Game on the river, and by far the strongest correlation we could find to explain these numbers was conservation efforts, and the agencies and research folks have all stated that as well. And this busy chart right here shows you that correlation that I'm talking about. On this side, here's our significant projects, conservation projects over time. So as those numbers, projects increase, that's that blue line, trend line right here, blue line right here. We see numbers of densities, trout per mile, which is over on this side of this chart, improve. So here's the red is the Nickerson Reach, and in green is the Breckenridge Reach. So just kind of gives you that correlation trend line visual right there. So what type of conservation projects are we talking about? This is one of our first fish screen, was our first fish screen on Badger Creek. So this is just east of Felt. And this was a irrigation structure that a little lady named Miss Buell dynamited at one point in time. She was tired of dealing with these head gates that got all jammed up by logs and debris, and she just went in there and blew it up. So this was a pretty easy sell to the irrigators. We rebuilt the entire structure and put in screens that look like this. This is Hog Canal and South Lee. Same kind of screens here. These are vertical belt rotating screens. They have openings, small openings within this black surface right here that allow the water to come on down through the head gates, down through the canal, but block the fish from ending up in the canal. Right over here is South Lee Creek. Any fish that enter into the canal screen bay counter these screens, and then there's a 6-inch pipe that the fish can swim through to get back into South Lee Creek over here. So same thing at the Badger fish screen as well. And these screens rotate very slowly, about every 5 minutes, so that they're constantly being cleaned and won't plug up with debris. We have determined through electrofishing surveys that approximately 5% of the cutthroat populations in Upper South Lee and Upper Badger, which are peer cutthroat populations, no brook trout up there, have been saved each year due to these fish screens. Because historically what would have happened is cutthroat would have been washed into these canals and perished out in the fields as the canals dried up later in the season. By putting in new head gates, we also improved in-stream flows because we had, obviously the irrigators could have much better control over the flow in the canals. This is also on Badger Creek, just downstream from the splitter project. And this is where we installed splitter fish screen project. This is where we installed a fish ladder right here. There's a check dam system right here. This is Badger Creek proper. And as Badger Creek starts to dry up later in this irrigation season, the irrigators go in and put a bunch of boards in here, which basically creates an impassable dam. Of course, the canal is just over here. And so as everything's drying up out there in Badger, this gives trout, Yellowstone cutthroat trout, the opportunity to move up and out of this pool that's down here and several pools downstream from here up into perennial waters for the rest of the season. So Canyon Creek, we've done a number of projects on Canyon Creek to improve flows and to also improve, and I'll get into our flow restoration program in just a minute, but to improve habitat conditions. The Lazy Triple Ranch up there did a large-scale stream restoration project several years ago, and then we've been busy working on these diversion structures, dams. So this is one of these check dams. Those are a bunch of boards that as the irrigation season goes on and things start to dry up a bit, the irrigators put these boards in, again, essentially creating barriers to fish passage. And we went in and worked with the irrigators to install a series of these big step pool rock weirs that you can see here, which back the water up where these check boards go in. You can see that structure right there, similar to this one. And then at the very bottom of these check boards, we put in a hole, good size, 6 inches tall by about 1.5 feet wide slot. So instead of the water going over the top of these check dams, it goes through that hole into these calm pools, and so fish can pass back and forth. So looking at the data for a Teton River Canyon, that Parkinson, IDFG Game Parkinson electrofishing survey site that Max was talking about, and seeing that huge jump in numbers, it's about the time we would expect to see cutthroat really respond to these projects we've been doing on Canyon Creek. And given that Canyon Creek is such an important spawning tributary for Yellowstone cutthroat trout, we feel that it's very likely that that large jump in cutthroat densities down there is due to the work on Canyon Creek. And that Parkinson Reach is right there at the mouth of Canyon Creek. So great news there. Again, that's what you hope to see, and we're seeing it. So hope that continues. Other types of projects, of course, lots and lots of stream restoration projects. Here's an example of a large-scale restoration project on Fox Creek that the Huntsmans have done as private landowners, and we've helped out with this project work. Fox Creek was over widened and full of silt, and they came in and rebuilt this whole channel, put in lots and lots of willows, and this was from a while back. These are about twice as tall now. So really improved Fox Creek tremendously. It's a very abundant fisheries now, not only for the non-natives, but cutthroat are doing really well in Fox Creek as well. This is our largest project to date, and many of you have seen presentations on this and have been out to see Teton Creek. So this was a project that we got into back in 2006. Teton Creek had been dredged out, channelized, converted from something that looked like this to this big ditch, which displaced about 120,000 tons of sediment. Most of that washed downstream and caused all kinds of problems, and continues to cause problems just out here east of Driggs. So big concerted effort by all types of stakeholders and partners to go in and rebuild Teton Creek. So it looked like this when we showed up. When we finished, it looked more like this. We improved fish habitat there by about 80% and reduced sediment as well. And this is a project out on Teton River that many of you may have had a chance to see last fall at the Bates access point. And so we worked together with the county, rancher out there in that area, and other stakeholders, agency stakeholders, Teton Regional Land Trust, to really create a showcase project that we hope others will use on Teton River as a means to restore Teton River. This is very similar to a lot of the work that the NRCS has been doing on Teton River as well. And so we really took a very, very fine-tooth comb to this project, looked at improving Yellowstone cutthroat trout habitat. Again, this is just downstream from the mouth of Teton Creek. Really important habitat for Yellowstone cutthroat trout by going out there, doing this kind of work, improving in-stream conditions, cleaning up the gravels by slightly narrowing the channel and increasing velocities. Should have a tremendous impact on Yellowstone cutthroat trout. Clean gravels are obviously much better for fish than silted in gravels. And so what we did is we recontoured the banks here and put in lots of willows. These are transplanted willow clumps that came out of the adjacent willow groves. And then right at the toe of the bank here, we put in these bundles of willow poles to hold that toe in place while all the vegetation grows. We also left big fishing gaps out here. So there are areas where we don't have willows, so people can get in and fish in Teton River without hanging up their lines. Of course, this is a really important recreation section on the river, so we thought about that quite a bit. And here's the boat ramp as well. We added a gravel pad next to the concrete pad for handcrafts to try to reduce the congestion on the concrete pad. Recontoured the bank so people can get in and out of their boats easily. And of course, we still have those fence posts there they can tie off to. And we have an active flow restoration program. So I mentioned earlier, they're working on restoring flows in Canyon Creek with the irrigators there, and a number of other key tributaries for Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And these types of flow programs that we put together, we work individually with landowners, developments, irrigators, ranchers, you name it. And they can lease their water, they can sell their water. It's up to them what they'd like to do to help improve in-stream flows. And we're seeing some really great success with that over time as well. Working with some irrigators on Spring Creek out by Tetonia. And then we also have the water users group. So this is a group comprised of young irrigators, youngerish, multi-generation irrigators to basically keep agricultural aspects and water use in business, and also make sure there's plenty of water to go around for people, wildlife, and fish as well. So that group's had some really great success in the watershed, and we really hope that is, will be the future of this valley, working together with everyone to ensure that we have plenty of water to go around. And that's it for me. So we've got some time for questions. I'll turn it back over to Zena.
Great, thanks, Mike. So we're coming up on 1 o'clock. So if you have to go, we'll just keep answering questions as they come in. And we'll also, for anyone who is on this video, you'll get an email within the next day or so with a link to this recording. So if you have to duck out and you're missing some questions at the end, you'll get a recording, so you'll be able to watch it. So if you have a question, there are a couple of ways. You can either type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I can monitor that. Or you're also welcome to raise your hand, and then I can let you ask your question directly. And so maybe we'll start with, we have a couple of folks with their hands raised. So we'll start with those two questions, and then we'll move to the Q&A. And so if Paul, if you want to, let's see, but I guess it's changing. So William, if you want to ask your question, I'll unmute you and you can ask. Go ahead, William, if you. Okay, we can't hear you, William, so maybe you could either type it into the chat or we'll come back to you if you raise your hand again. Great. So questions coming in. A question about brown trout spawning. Do you think that the brown trout are spawning in the main stem of the Teton River or in a tributary?
Main stem. Yeah, brown trout are typically main stem spawners. We have pit tag brown trout, and we haven't picked any up in our tributaries. They will go into spring creeks and spawn as well, and even main stem of tributaries, but primarily main stem of the river. And in particular, it appears that habitat down, from Pack Saddle from 4,000 north to the highway is pretty ideal for them. Large, deep pools with some spawning gravels nearby.
Great. Are you concerned about the large increase in brook trout densities in the upper Teton?
Yeah, brook trout are a constant issue for Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And really, as long as those Yellowstone cutthroat trout numbers keep holding steady and hopefully continue to improve, that's good news. But brook trout are a serious problem, and it's something the agencies are looking into. There's no real easy solution to deal with brook trout yet. We hope that by improving conditions for Yellowstone cutthroat trout, not only in Teton River, but in key spawning tributaries like Teton Creek, that we can play that numbers game and keep cutthroat numbers cranked up enough that we can keep the brook trout numbers at least at bay, and perhaps even see those numbers go down over time.
Great. A question about, I guess, saying how can we practically increase fluvial trout use in Teton Creek or Trail Creek? What's a practical solution to that challenge?
Yeah, that's really comes down to strategic flow restoration work, and obviously screening out canals to prevent entrainment in the canals on those tributaries. But that takes a huge collaborative effort, and we are certainly working with irrigators and other folks that have water rights on those tributaries to figure out ways to restore flows so that cutthroat can spawn and the fry can get back down to Teton River again, complete their life cycle from that late May to middle of August. And we're actively working towards that goal, and we're hopeful that we can get there before long.
Great. Is there a concern about increasing rainbow trout hybridization with cutthroat?
Great question. Yep, that is absolutely a huge concern. It's something that's been monitored really closely. Luckily, in this watershed, as with quite a few watersheds, there's quite a separation in spawning windows. Although, as time goes on, you can get these what's called hybrid swarms. And so if you have rapidly changing conditions, for example, the drought that we saw across the west back in 2000, in some watersheds where those spawning windows were not as separate between rainbow spawning and cutthroat spawning like we have in our watershed, and there were more hybrids, they saw very dramatic changes very quickly, and hybrids were just all of a sudden everywhere within just a couple of years. So that early 2000s drought was a really dramatic example of that. That's the kind of event that the agencies and Friends of Teton River were definitely nervous about and monitoring. And it's a tough one. There's not a lot that can be done other than really working towards conservation projects that help to mitigate for climate change, so that if and when we get the next drought, a really warm cycle, we can hopefully be in good shape, so that we won't see those types of dramatic and quick changes with hybridization.
Great. What are ways that you can sort of reduce non-native trout populations and increase cutthroat trout populations? What are some practical ways that you can do that in our tributaries and the main stem?
Yeah, great question. You know, for us as a nonprofit, again, we don't have anything to do with removing non-natives or any of that type of work other than supporting the agencies and providing the data. So we've really been focused on improving conditions for Yellowstone cutthroat trout and tributaries where they're thriving, ensuring that they're not becoming entrained in canals, for example. So that's where our fish screens are on tributaries that are still pure cutthroat. And then focusing in on habitat in those tributaries and trying to make those tributaries as climate resilient as we can, climate change resilient as we can. And so that's been our primary focus, and the numbers are showing that those efforts are really making a big difference. So again, we're hoping that just by focusing in on these key Yellowstone cutthroat trout producing streams and protecting what we have left will be the key to that. I think down the road, it's possible the agencies will come in and do some active non-native removal, but it really takes it's going to be up to the agencies, and it's a huge effort. Certainly anglers removing non-natives does help, but it really is going to take something like what we've seen on the South Fork to make an impact in the non-natives. They just do really well up here.
Do you have any plans for installing screens or diversions on Teton Creek?
You know, that's something that's been in discussion with the irrigators for many years. It's something we would love to see. Again, that's going to take the irrigators really getting on board with that to see that happen. But we certainly have it as some of our higher priority projects to screen the canals on Teton Creek, and hopefully we'll get there before too long.
Great. And then a question about recreation, saying with the increased use on the Teton River, how is this impacting the fishery and how is it being addressed? I could send that over to Amy too, if Amy wants to answer that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Amy can chime in.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Amy.
That's fine. I don't have video right now, but I'm the disembodied voice that's now talking. So at this point, we have seen trends showing that trout populations are increasing during the same time period that recreational use has also been increasing, not likely correlated with one another, but they're both increasing at the same time. That is certainly something that we will continue to monitor. So, you know, we hope not to ever see any detrimental impacts. We don't believe that there are any to fish populations at this time. There certainly could be detrimental impacts to other wildlife or to, you know, certainly the user experience and the fishing experience on the river. And that user experience and fishing experience is certainly something that Idaho Fish and Game and Teton County, which are the entities that have regulatory authority over the river, are concerned about. Teton County and Idaho Fish and Game, but each of them have different kinds of regulatory authority, both, you know, limited to certain aspects. But both of them have been you know, meeting together, meeting with businesses and other entities, and are in the process of developing plans to try to deal with those recreational impacts. It's something that's extremely challenging to do. It's especially challenging in Idaho. In Idaho, there is not one single clear regulatory authority over recreational use. There is in some other states, but there's not in Idaho. It's really a place where there's a gap in governance. However, those that do have that authority are concerned about it. They are they are currently really invested in trying to find ways to ensure that we don't, you know, have significant detrimental impacts on wildlife, fish, and users of the river moving forward. I think it's likely that there will be a recreational management plan developed for the Teton River. These usually take a couple of years. I think that effort will likely be starting quite soon, and there will be a lot of opportunity for public input into that recreation management plan. That's something that Friends of the Teton River will be really involved in getting the word out about how folks can be involved. We will certainly be a stakeholder at the table. We'll be involved in helping to provide information about that process moving forward, as well as providing education about how folks can use the river in the lowest impact way.
Thanks, Amy. Question for Mike and or Max. Is there any effort to recover fish that do get trapped in irrigation canals?
You know, that's something that we have participated in the past. It's not something that we regularly put large efforts into because it is very time consuming, and sometimes you can get into some fish and make a dent in helping the population out, but most of the time that's pretty difficult to do since they're so spread out through the canals, and then access becomes an issue as well. So it's not something that we typically have as part of our springtime our program, but once in a while we will. If there's a pool that for whatever reason is filled full of cutthroat in any particular year, we will do some rescues from time to time.
Great, thank you. So that looks like that's it for questions. Thank you, Mike and Max and Amy, for sharing your work. And thank you all for participating, for taking some time off of your lunch break.
Great questions, by the way. Yeah, really, really great questions, by the way. So keep asking, keep coming around and asking.
Great. So we'll send, there was some requests for the data that was shared that both you, Mike, and Max shared. And so we can send out the slide deck as well as the recording of this presentation. We'll make it public so that it can be shared with anyone. And if you have any additional questions, we would be happy to answer them. I would say just reach out. You could reach out to any of us directly, or you could send an email to info@tetonwater.org and we can direct you to the right person.